You did not notice it at first. Nothing in the moment felt unusual. The tone of the room felt familiar. The way people spoke to you felt expected. The tension that appeared from time to time felt like something that simply happened. You moved through it without stopping to question it. When something hurt, you registered it quietly and continued. When something felt off, you told yourself it was part of how things were. You adjusted your reactions so the moment could move on. The pattern felt ordinary because it arrived gradually. Nothing dramatic announced itself. Small discomforts appeared and you made room for them. A sharp comment, a long silence, a situation that left you feeling tight in your chest. You felt these things and kept going. You did not pause to ask if they should feel different. You assumed the problem was how you received them. You thought maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you expected too much. Maybe this was simply how people live together. Over time, you stopped measuring the discomfort. You stopped comparing it to anything else. What you experienced became the reference point. It became the background of your days. It became the tone of your interactions. When something stung, you treated it like weather, something that passes through without needing explanation. You stayed calm, you stayed polite, you stayed present. There were moments when a small voice inside you noticed the strain, a brief awareness that something did not sit right. The feeling appeared and then faded. You smoothed it over. You returned to the rhythm you already knew. You continued moving through situations the same way. You adjusted your expectations. You lowered your reactions. You told yourself that this was simply how things felt. What surrounded you became your definition of ordinary. The tension, the restraint, the quiet endurance. It all blended into something that did not stand out anymore. And after a while, you stopped calling it discomfort at all. You called it normal. You did not arrive at this suddenly. The shift happened slowly, almost quietly. Moments that once felt uncomfortable began to lose their edge. Situations that once made you pause started to pass without much thought. You adjusted your expectations so the experience would fit. When something hurt, you told yourself it was temporary. When something felt wrong, you told yourself it was ordinary. You made small explanations inside your mind that allowed the moment to continue without interruption. This pattern repeated itself often enough that it began to feel familiar. A comment that landed too sharply. A silence that stayed too long. A tension in the room that made your shoulders tighten. You noticed these things, but you did not question them for long. You returned to the flow of the moment. You became skilled at smoothing the edges of your experience. If something felt uncomfortable, you explained it away. If something left you unsettled, you minimized it. You reminded yourself that people have difficult moments. You reminded yourself that situations are complicated. The explanations were not loud. They were quiet adjustments in how you understood what was happening around you. You lowered your expectations just enough to make the moment manageable. You told yourself that discomfort was part of being close to others. You told yourself that tension was part of living with people. You told yourself that the strain you felt was something everyone carried. Over time, these adjustments changed the way you perceived things. The same situations that once made you uneasy began to feel expected. Your body still noticed them, but your mind no longer treated them as unusual. You stayed calm. You stayed polite. You stayed steady. When something unsettled you, you did not name it. You continued with the conversation. You continued with the day. Sometimes there was a brief moment when you sensed the strain more clearly. A short pause inside you. A feeling that something did not quite belong. The moment appeared and then dissolved. You moved past it before it could become a question. You learned to interpret discomfort as something ordinary, something that simply happens in the background of daily life. And as this interpretation repeated itself, the line between what hurt and what felt acceptable slowly faded. What once felt difficult began to blend into the normal rhythm of things, not because the discomfort disappeared, but because you learned to see it as something that was simply part of the way things were. You stayed with it long enough that it stopped standing out. The discomfort did not disappear, but it no longer arrived as something unusual. It came and went the way familiar weather moves through a day. You felt it, registered it, and continued with what you were doing. At first, there may have been small signals inside you. A pause, a tightening in your chest, a moment where something felt slightly wrong. The signal appeared and you noticed it. Then you adjusted yourself so the moment could continue. You told yourself that situations are complicated. People have difficult moods. Conversations carry tension. You allowed these explanations to settle around the feeling. They softened the sharpness of it. They made it easier to stay where you were. This process repeated many times. Each time the discomfort appeared, you handled it the same way. You quieted your reaction. You reduced the importance of the moment. You returned your attention to whatever needed to happen next. Over time, this became almost automatic. The body registered the strain. The mind responded with patience. You told yourself that things would pass. You reminded yourself that staying calm was the reasonable thing to do. You continued to remain present. You kept the conversation moving. You kept the day unfolding the way it was already going. When something stung, you did not linger on it. You placed it somewhere inside you where it would not interrupt the moment. The discomfort did not need to disappear for you to move forward. You simply learned how to carry it without letting it interrupt your rhythm. Sometimes you noticed how much space this required. A quiet effort to remain composed. A careful adjustment of your reactions. You stayed attentive to your tone, your posture, your words. You made sure nothing spilled over. The outside remained steady. Your voice stayed even. Your expression stayed neutral. The moment moved forward without disruption. Inside, you kept making room for what did not feel right. You shifted your expectations. You lowered the importance of the discomfort. You reminded yourself that many things in life require patience. The more often this happened, the more ordinary it began to feel. What once would have caught your attention became something that blended into the background of daily life. You stopped measuring it. You stopped comparing it to anything else. It was simply part of how things were. Occasionally, there was still a small moment when you noticed it more clearly. A brief awareness that something was heavier than it needed to be. The awareness appeared quietly and then passed just as quietly. You did not stay with that awareness long enough to turn it into a question. Instead, you returned to the pattern you already knew. You kept your place in the conversation. You kept the day moving forward. You kept adjusting yourself so the moment would remain smooth. In this way, the strain continued to exist, but it no longer asked for attention. It became something you carried while everything else continued around you. And the longer this continued, the easier it became to treat that weight as something that simply belonged there. You continued to live with it the way people live with familiar surroundings. It did not always draw your attention. It was simply there, woven into the rhythm of everyday moments. When something unsettled you, the reaction was small and quiet. You noticed it briefly and then allowed the moment to pass. The day kept moving, conversations continued, and you stayed present within them. There was no clear point where you decided that this was acceptable. The adjustment happened gradually. Each time something felt uncomfortable, you softened the meaning of it just enough for the moment to continue. Over time, the discomfort stopped appearing as a signal that required action. It became something you absorbed quietly while the rest of life carried on. You told yourself that this was simply how relationships worked. People had difficult moods. Situations carried tension. Moments did not always feel easy. You accepted these explanations because they helped the day remain steady. The more often you accepted them, the more natural they began to feel. You learned how to keep your voice even when something inside you felt tight. You learned how to remain calm while the conversation moved forward. You learned how to hold your place in the room without letting the strain interrupt the moment. From the outside, nothing unusual was visible. Your expression stayed neutral. Your posture stayed relaxed. The interaction continued in the same familiar rhythm. Inside, you quietly adjusted yourself to match the situation. Eventually, the effort of adjusting became so routine that you barely noticed it happening. What once might have caught your attention became something that passed through the background of the day. The tension, the patience, the quiet endurance all blended into the atmosphere around you. There was no dramatic shift when this happened, no moment where the change announced itself. Instead, it settled slowly into the way things felt. And once it settled there, it no longer appeared as something that needed to be questioned. It simply felt like the normal shape of things. And when something becomes familiar enough, the mind stops asking whether it should be different. It simply continues living inside it.